Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My other name is Bond, James Bond. It is a great honor to be here. And I should mention that I went to a Christmas party this year, met a rather nice elderly English gentleman, and we talked for about 10 minutes, and I have a slightly odd English accent because of what I've lived. And he said, "Are you English?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "My name is Bond, James Bond," which is my standard response because I'm very tired of being told that my accent is cute. And he looked at me and said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "That's strange, I haven't met you. I wrote 2 of the James Bond movie scripts." And he had. He thought it was hilarious, so I have to be very careful what I tell this joke, but obviously it's safe in Kansas City, although I did meet one English gentleman in the back there, but I think he and I are safe. Are we safe, sir? We are, okay. I want to warn you straight off, ladies and gentlemen, that I haven't given this lecture for 3 years, so I'm a little rusty. But what I'm going to do is tell you the story of the Cro-Magnons, who were the first Europeans who were truly anatomically and mentally modern, like ourselves. And this is a story of 2 groups. The first are the Neanderthals, archaic humans who didn't have the full intellectual abilities that we have. And they originated in Europe around 250,000 years ago and became extinct about 30 million years ago. Say again? 30,000, sorry. I'm tired. Then there are the second group of players, who are the Cro-Magnons. Fully modern people, anatomically, with all the articulate speech and all the cognitive abilities of Homo sapiens. My friends, we are the wise people. We are Homo sapiens. Although listening to the recent political campaigns, I wonder. But seriously, we are the wise people. We love, we hate. We're born, we grow up, we go adult. We get married, we have children. We negotiate, we argue, sometimes we fight. We innovate, and we plan ahead. Why am I telling you this? You know that. I'm telling you because the Cro-Magnons were truly the first absolutely modern Europeans. And one of the fascinating dynamics of this story is the interplay between the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals. What does the word Cro-Magnon mean? Back in 1858, some railroad workers building the rail line into the small village of Les Aisies in southwestern France, dug into earth at the foot of a cliff to build some railroad workers' houses. And they found a rock shelter, a cavity in the side of a cliff, which are abundant around Les Aisies. You can see them up here. How many of you have been to Les Aisies? Not enough. Seriously, if you have a chance to go, isn't it gorgeous? Did you eat there? Ah, mwah. Anyway, the cave was called Cro-Magnon, which basically means cliff. And in it, they found some skeletons of completely modern people, accompanied by the bones of reindeer and other Arctic animals from a time when Europe was gripped in the Ice Age. And these apparently were the first modern Europeans, and have been so ever since 1858. But before we get into the Cro-Magnons and their origins, let's have a look at the Neanderthals. Neanderthals are, of course, the classic cave people. You know the cartoons of the man with a wooden club dragging around his cave woman wife by her long hair. All of this originated back in the early years of the last century, when a French anthropologist, whose name was Marcel Boule, investigated a skeleton found in a rock shelter called La Chapelle-aux-Saints and studied it in detail. Now, Marcelin Boule was a very, very good anthropologist of the day, but he failed to realize that this skeleton, among other things, was of an individual who had chronic arthritis, and it was stooped over, and he described it as a primitive, shambling brute. And the Neanderthals have suffered from this stereotype, as you can see here, ever since. What exactly were the Neanderthals? They were archaic humans. There were probably only about 30,000 of them between the Atlantic coast of Europe and Central Asia. They did not have the full cognitive abilities of us. They did not innovate. They didn't think ahead. They were hunters, and they were very successful ones. But they were no match for the Cro-Magnons, who first came into Europe about 45,000 years ago. And one of the fascinating sides of all this is here the Cro-Magnons arrived in Europe, small numbers of them, and they encountered the Cro-Magnons. Question: what happened to the Cro-Magnons? What did they do in the face of the incoming modern humans? Recently, Santi Pabbo, who is the German geneticist here, and others have provided genetic evidence which suggests that some Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals actually interbred. They had torrid sex. Fortunately, later in the series, there was a geneticist coming who will discuss the genetic evidence for this. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, literate in genetics, but it's a very interesting suggestion, because what happened between these two groups is one of the very central questions, not only of prehistory as a whole, but of Cro-Magnons. What do you do when you meet somebody you're totally unfamiliar to you? Because the Neanderthals were very distinctive people. They had a very deep ancestry in the original hominins back here. 2 million years ago, Homo habilis, the first human. Homo ergaster, a slightly more advanced human, very archaic. And then up here, again, a rather archaic human. Look at the brow ridges. And from these people came not only Homo neanderthalis, but fully modern humans. And what we're talking about here is the relationship between these two. Rather limited intellectual abilities, and here, fully modern people like ourselves. What were the Neanderthals like? We know a number of things about them. Firstly, from their bones, they were immensely strong. Secondly, they were very, very tough people because they hunted large animals. Our gentleman over there is a hunter. But what you're talking about aren't deer. You're talking about bison and wild ox. What did they hunt them with? They hunted them with fire-hardened, razor-sharp spears, and with spears that were mounted with stone tips, flaked in a more or less triangular shape, and then they made scrapers they used to scrape the skins for their clothing. And they made them using flint, fine-grained rock cores from which they took the flakes from which they made these artifacts. That's all the weaponry they had. Now, I want you to imagine trying to hunt a bison or a wild ox, and don't think the domestic ox. Think a very nasty, frisky animal with sharp horns. And you've got to get close enough to that animal to give it a lethal wound, only with a thrown spear. How do you do this? Forgive me, I like walking around. Many years ago, when I was a young, naive boy, I went hunting with an African farmer in Zambia. And he was armed with a flintlock musket. And I swear to God that went back to the days of Napoleon. And we hunted an animal called an impala, which is a small antelope that likes long grass and leaps, just very nervous. And we stalked it. And he got me within about 10 yards of that animal. And the animal looked up. Have you ever stood on one foot for 30 seconds wishing to scratch your behind? Because that's what it involved. And then the animal started grazing. He picked up his musket and missed. We had to start all over again. But this experience taught me just how difficult it was and how good the Neanderthals were at stalking, because they had to get this close. And what they literally did was to jump on the animal and spear it between the shoulder blades into the heart. Try doing that to a mammoth or a bison. And it's interesting that many of the injuries on Cro-Magnon bodies are those equivalent to people who are rodeo riders. Now, I'm not kidding, they are. And all of this happened during a period of intense cold. Now, we live in a warming world. And I cannot communicate to you how different the world of Europe was 20,000, 30,000 years ago. And we're all familiar with the Ice Age. And we all immediately think refrigerator, intense cold. We think of very, very sub-zero winters, 9 months or more. And these were the conditions in which the Neanderthals flourished. But what is not generally known is that, in fact, the climate was extremely variable. Look at these squiggles. These reflect the latest information on colder, warmer, colder, warmer, colder, warmer, colder, colder about 20,000 years ago, and then warmer, and then warm today. And it was in this period here that the Cro-Magnons entered Europe. Now, the Neanderthals had lived here when it was very cold and were well adapted to cold conditions, but they were no match for the Cro-Magnons. So there's the scene set. Tough, very agile hunters. But what's amazing about the Neanderthals is they were in Europe from about 250,000 years ago up to 30,000 years ago. And as far as we can tell, their life did not change one bit. They lived in small hunting bands. They moved with the game, and in the summers they ate a few plant foods. They lived mainly off large animals. They had a very, very simple technology. Stone-tipped spears, wooden spears, clubs. As far as we know, they had very little interest in the afterlife. They had no symbolic life. They had no art. They were archaic humans. And life didn't change for hundreds of thousands of years. And then we came along, the wise people. It appears that the first modern humans, and this is based on both genetics and on fossil evidence, appeared in tropical Africa about 20,000 years ago. 200,000, sorry. Now, you're listening, great. I'm used to undergraduate audiences who don't listen. They sleep gently. And then, the issue of issues is, when did these people spread out to colonize Africa? The answer is we don't really know. But there was a defining event which happened in 73,000 years ago. And that was when Mount Toba, an active volcano, in Sumatra in Southeast Asia exploded and literally disintegrated into space. It created a volcanic crater 63 miles long and 1,200 feet deep, filled with water. Now, hundreds, thousands of tons of volcanic rock exploded into the air and fell on the surrounding country. Huge clouds of ash spread with the winds into the South China Sea and across India, maybe as far as the Middle East. At the time, and this is where it gets interesting, there were very sparse human populations in Southeast Asia and anywhere, probably numbered in the maybe low 100,000s. Compare that with the 7 billion on Earth today. But the ash appears to have mantled much of the ancient world at a time when we think the first modern humans were spreading out of Africa. And in Africa itself and elsewhere, because of the ash in the atmosphere, there was the equivalent of a 9-year nuclear winter. And in Africa, it was cold and it was extremely dry. And it was in these conditions, this huge natural catastrophe, which is the largest eruption over the last 700,000 years. It makes Krakatoa in 1883 or Mount Helens look like little momentary breaks of wind. And it has been estimated by someone who knows what they're talking about that probably only about 10,000 people survived it, most of them in Africa. And these people were modern humans. And maybe, and this is all very speculative, it was after this that people began to spread into other parts of the world and into Europe. Let's have a closer look. I do stress this is all very speculative still, but it looks as if modern humans emerged in this general area. Certainly down here, there is evidence of people who were using quite advanced technologies, very much more advanced than those of the Neanderthals, at least 70 or 80,000 years ago. And somewhere around 70,000 years ago, they moved out of Africa, either here or there, and they moved across into Asia, but the ones we're talking about moved into here and lived alongside Neanderthals. And it may be here there was some interbreeding between Neanderthals and moderns. And then the first modern humans spread into Europe. And they spread, and we don't really know much about it, up here into Central Asia and over here into southeastern Europe. They were there about 42 to 45,000 years ago. And it seems as if teeny numbers of them went right across very rapidly into Western Europe. But this was the moment, about 38 to 40,000 years ago, where there was another huge volcanic eruption. Where was this one? It was in Italy by Naples, close to Vesuvius. And this spread ash all the way across to the Don River in the Ukraine and over this area. And that's very useful. Why? Because that layer of ash overlays a few very, very sparse modern human sites. And then above it, you find much more intensive occupation by Cro-Magnons, which appears to have brought people in larger numbers here after about 41,000 years ago. So you've got a movement from here, a volcanic eruption, which may have stopped things, and then the movement in. Now, what does this mean in terms of Neanderthals? The Neanderthals are very difficult to reconstruct. We know that they were very thin on the ground. We know that they were expert stalkers. And above all, and this is me talking as an individual, I don't know what the official position is, I think they were very good observers. Contemplate hunting a wild ox. If you're not a good observer, you're certainly not going to be able to get close to it unless you have an intimate knowledge of its habits. And when the modern humans came in, the Neanderthals must have spent a lot of time observing them. And as these unfamiliar people came in, probably the contacts between them are very sporadic and rare. Have you ever met people with whom you have nothing in common, not a common language or anything like that? Many, many years ago, once again when I was a young boy in Africa, I went with my African girlfriend into a remote area of the Zambezi Valley. And we took our Land Rover down our old track and ended up in a farming village. And we got out, and the people and the headman, and these people were wearing loincloths. And we went up to them. And my girlfriend came from the plateau, 3,000 foot up. And she spoke a variety of their language. And she looked at these people, and they looked at us, and you could see the lack of comprehension in their faces. Many of them had never seen a white person. And she turned to me and said, "Brian, these people are savages." And she meant it. And eventually we communicated, or I did, by smiling and by gestures. And eventually we got on fine. Once they realized that we had benign intent. Then we opened the Land Rover hood, and some of the kids came up and peered in, and I pressed the horn. Ah! They went, and that broke the ice. Humans are very common. But imagine doing this with people who maybe smell differently, whom you find repulsive, who are always occasionally on the fringes of your life. I think the contacts at best were cautious, but most of the time probably were just a matter of observing, because the Neanderthals were doomed. They were doomed in a world which was unimaginably harsh. What did Europe look like 45,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago? Very different from today. Up in the north, a huge ice sheet covered the North Sea, I want you to remember that, covered Britain and covered Scandinavia. Sea levels were 400 feet below today's, 400 feet. Britain, unfortunately, was part of the continent. And an enormous zone of treeless open tundra extended from the Atlantic deep into Siberia. The Alps were covered with ice. Winters lasted 9 months a year with months on end of sub-zero temperatures. The only places where there were more favorable environments were deep river valleys in southwest France, in southern Germany, and in the Balkans, or along the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean itself, which is much smaller today than today, and was a chilly lake covered with, or often frequented by, savage sub-zero storms. This was not a benign environment. But the people who came in, the Cro-Magnons, were completely different from the Neanderthals. Why? Because they lived in a world that was totally different. They lived, and this may seem bizarre, a deeply symbolic world. A world where they knew every type of grass, every type of tree, the habits of animals, the colors of animals, where the environment was alive. And they thought of animals as living things. They thought of the supernatural world being part of daily life. There was this continuum between the supernatural world and the living world. And this world was defined by people who today are known as shamans. People with unusual supernatural powers who would go into trances, would participate in ceremonies, and in trance would move from the living world into the supernatural one, very often assuming the mask or the figure of an animal. They transformed themselves. And here you see one of the earliest sculptures ever produced, a sculpture 34,000 years ago from a cave in southern Germany. Now notice that the body is human, but the head is that of a lion. This may be a shaman transforming himself in trance into an animal, passing effortlessly into the supernatural world. Again, when I was a young boy, I went to village meetings in Africa. And these village meetings, which were almost invariably about land and water, were deeply entertaining. People told stories. They told jokes. There was anger and shouting. But in the end, they worked out the solutions. But every meeting I went to, and these agreed were farmers, not hunters, began with a spirit medium or a shaman uttering a prayer, not to God, but to the ancestors and the forces of the spiritual world, because life was a cycle. It was a cycle of circular cycle of the endless passage of the seasons. Growth and spring and birth, growing to adulthood, having children, getting married, the harvest, old age, and then the winter, which was death. And you knew that the next cycle of life would begin a year later. And you knew that when you died, you would become an ancestor and become part of this great cycle, because the ancestors were the guardians of the land. And this I've never forgotten, because what you're really looking at is a pattern that goes right back to the Stone Age, of people who believed that the world they were living in had a continuum with the supernatural world. And this was the striking difference between the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals. But there was another striking difference as well, and that was the technology. How many of you are carrying Swiss Army knives? Look at them, well-armed people. I am going to die. If you look at that Swiss Army knife, it is basically a chassis. And from it strive many different types of tools. The most striking thing about the Cro-Magnons was that their technology was totally different. You may remember that the Neanderthals had stone-tipped spears and wooden spears. The Cro-Magnons not only produced dozens of standardized thin blades made from flint, struck off from cylindrical cores, but they turned them into knives, into projectile points, into scrapers, and into tools for processing bone. We'll look at this again in a moment. The technology was much more specialized, and much of it, using human brains, was used for specialized purposes, like spearing fish, hunting birds, hunting large or small animals. But by far the most striking difference between the Neanderthals and moderns was quite simply the Cro-Magnon art. Back in 2004, a group of French cave explorers discovered in southeastern France the Grotte de Chauvet. This cave, which had been sealed since the Ice Age, contained masterpieces of cave art which date back at least 31,000 years. In other words, they came into use, they started painting very soon after they came to Europe. What did they paint? They painted animals they hunted with consummate skill. Rhinoceroses with long hair which adapted them to Arctic conditions. Wild horses. Look at the way he's done multiple horses there. Or this famous one of multiple rhinos with their horns. That is very skilled technique. All of this is in a sealed cave. And ever since then, archaeologists have argued as to what this means. Lionesses, cave bears, bison, horses, and so on. What does this mean? It's something that we'll come back to later on. But I want you to think of these animals as part of the continuum of Cro-Magnon life. These people were familiar with animals. We go to Africa at vast expense and look at antelope. We say, wow. You just walk out of the cave and you'd see bison, buffalo. And they would be there every day, and you're familiar with these animals, with reindeer. And that gives you a very different relationship with them. Because to survive, they had to hunt them. But they also knew that their lives depended on animals continuing. So it seems that there was a huge body of ritual in these caves which surrounded these animals. And many, many years ago, again when I was a young boy, I went to a cave called Lake Combrel in southwest France, which is full of engravings. And these engravings are hundreds of feet from the entrance in a small dark chamber down narrow passages. We went in with a guide with an acetylene lamp which flickered. And it was quiet. And we got in the chamber at the end where there were reindeer and bison on the wall. And suddenly, he turned out the light. I swear you could feel the animals there. Then he turned it on low, and it flickered. And my friends, the animals moved on the walls. And you realized that to go in this cave with fat lamps, animal fat lamps which flickered, must have been an extremely profound erosional experience. What are these caves? They're here in southwestern France. Famous one, Lascaux, Pechmerle, Altamira in northern Spain. An area which, during the late Ice Age when it was cold, was basically a refuge area with deep river valleys where people could take shelter in the winter. An elaborate body of ritual. Why? Because they needed it. Because the bestiary they hunted was not only extraordinarily varied, but required very different skills, which we'll look at in a moment. Now these animals, many of them were what you would call big game. Most of them died out at the end of the Ice Age. On the left, the woolly mammoth, adapted to extreme Arctic condition. They flourished in Siberia as late as 9,000 years ago, with thick felt under their long hides. People hunted them. They hunted them by trapping them in swamps, as far as we can tell. The woolly rhinoceros, the bison, and above all, the aurochs, the primordial ox, which survived in Poland until 1627 AD. And they, in fact, have reconstituted them biologically. And if you go to Les Aisies, you can see them. They have a lively animal. You don't want to get on the wrong side of those horns. So you're talking about people who hunted an extremely varied and very, very formidable collection of animals. But the animal they harvested above all was the reindeer, Rangifer tarandus. This, as you know, is a gregarious animal that migrates. And today's science is so precise that they've been able to track reindeer from the Pyrenees into southwest France, who move up in the spring and move back in the winter. They've actually been able to trace them by looking at the growth on their teeth. And it seems that many Cro-Magnon bands depended on migrations. Do we have a parallel for this today? We do, in the caribou of Canada. And these caribou migrate predictably in spring and fall. And even today, the Inuit and the Eskimo hunt them, this time, of course, with rifles, as they cross streams. I want you to imagine migrating caribou or reindeer. Not one or two beasts, but a stream of them like a river. Imagine them crossing the shallows, and the people know where these animals are going to cross, because they've done it year after year after year. And they wait. And as the animals move into midstream, the hunters move in and spear as many as they can, while letting many of them go. And then they butcher them, and they keep the meat for later consumption. Why? Because they have lean seasons. And the harvest of these animals depended on extremely sophisticated weaponry. And this weaponry was based on the notion of a Swiss Army knife. The Swiss Army knife, as you well know, is a chassis. And on the chassis, you have a series of extraordinarily useless artifacts. But among them a useful one, a corkscrew, a beer bottle opener, and two blades. Even a saw, which doesn't really work. But I want to imagine yourself going back and being a Cro-Magnon. They had flint. And the flint, they would, using punches, punch out a whole lot of standardized sized, parallel-sided, thin flint blades with very sharp edges. And then, and this is where they were different from the Neanderthals, they didn't just make spear points, they made amazing range of different tools. They made backed blades, which they mounted in spear points. They made scrapers. They made spoke shaves. They made awls for drilling holes in ivory. Why? Because then they could make needles. And if you have a needle, you can make clothing, tailored clothing. Why is this important? Because in very cold environments, you have to have layered clothing. Why? Because when it's hot, you take it off. When it's cold, you put it on. Why? Because of the danger of hypothermia. There was nothing these people didn't know about coping with the cold. But most interesting of all, what they did was to take an implement called a burin, which is basically a chisel. And they would take reindeer antler, which is fresh, and they would carve into the beam. And they would take out splinters, and from these, they would make antler points, which were lethally sharp, which they would mount on spears. At the same time, there was one other difference. They developed an implement called a spear thrower. A spear thrower is literally a stick or a piece of antler with a hook. And onto the hook, you put your spear. And then you hold it like this, and you go, whoosh, and you flick. And by doing that, you increase not only the velocity of the missile, but its range. And with practice, these were fiendishly accurate. And this was the way they hunted many reindeer, by using like that. Now these people knew their weaponry. Many years ago, and this really was a long time ago, when I was at Cambridge, not Oxford, Cambridge, I had a wonderful elderly ethnographic anthropological professor who was an expert on ancient tools. And every year, and he was famous for this, he would take us out in the courtyard and he would demonstrate an Australian Aborigine spear thrower. And he was a plump gentleman. And he would take it and he would go, and there'd be this sort of flaccid, and and it would go about 20 yards. But for some reason or other, on that particular morning, maybe he took Viagra, although before that, he did it, and somehow he connected, and he drove a spear straight into an open window in the botany lab across the courtyard. We learned it was very effective. There were complaints. But make no mistake, joking apart, these were extremely effective weapons. And they gave people a huge advantage over the Neanderthals. Here you can see the arrows here, which are the chisel ends of these implements called chisels or burins. There's a needle, but look how they took the grooves out. They would groove it, they would lever it out, and then they would very simply grind it into a spear or some similar artifact. Then they would mount them like this. And very often, they would mount it as a point. Then they would have a detachable piece of antler bound to the shaft and bound there. Why? Because you would throw your spear, it would hit, say, a reindeer. And as it hit, maybe the reindeer would jump up wounded and run, but the spear would break off at the foreshaft. So simply you put on a new foreshaft and away you went again. These guys were expert on the equivalent of Stone Age machine guns. And I cannot tell you how big this was. Many, many years ago in Africa, I once went driving across a floodplain in a Land Rover in an area which was a game reserve. And over, this was treeless, and over on the left, I looked over, and there appeared to be some trees. And I said to the guy in the car with me, who knew the area, I didn't know you had trees here. And he looked at me and said, they're not. And at that moment, the trees started moving. This was 30,000 antelope in a herd. 3,000. And I realized then what we've lost. This was an area rich in predators, lions, hyenas, dangerous, bears. But the game was amazing. And the reindeer migrations were not 1,000 animals, they were tens of thousands of animals. And these animals were hunted, and they were hunted on streams like you see here. This is not a particularly, the screen is a little small. Let me just try something. You can just see the hunters over here. It's a lovely reconstruction of Cro-Magnon life. Where did I find it? I found it in a French children's book in a museum in Les Aisies. I had a hell of a job getting permission to use it. But it shows what it was like, because on some of the caves you can see paintings of rows of heads with the antlers, which is a picture of reindeer crossing a river. They didn't only hunt large animals, they hunted small ones, like the ptarmigan here, or the Arctic fox. Oh, how cute. They hunted thousands of Arctic hares, why? Not to eat, but clothing. Because another thing, if you read about Eskimo, you'll find that their traditional clothing, they used all kinds of different animals to make different things. For example, if you look at the Aleutian Islanders in Alaska, these guys spent most of their life in kayaks. And their boots were made from the neck hides of sea lions. Why? Because they weren't slippery and they were really tough and they were waterproof. But the inside of hoods were made from wolf fur, which protected them from subarctic winds. So these people knew everything, like we do, about living in an Arctic environment. And we know of this from excavations, mainly in caves. And this is a very famous cave called Abré-Pateau in southwestern France, which was occupied from about 35,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, with hundreds of minute occupation levels, which were dissected by a team from Harvard University over many, many years, which gave us a picture of these people. And many times, they didn't live in the cave in the way we did. They would erect tents, like this leather tent here, and they would live there, particularly in the summer or in the winter. Often they put big hide curtains down. They would have hearths. They would fabricate tools. The elderly would lie in beds in there. They would hunt. And always they had an overlook over the valley watching the game that moved in here winter and summer. And most of these caves and rock shelters were south-facing. Why? Because that's where the sun comes in summer and winter. But the most famous thing about the Cro-Magnons is the art. And probably the two most famous caves of all are Lascaux in France and Altamira in northern Spain. Lascaux, which was sealed until 1940, is famous for its magnificent 17,000-year-old primordial ox, for its bison, and for other animals which, when they were found, were so fresh that it appeared they were painted yesterday. The cave now has been shut. Why? Because of bacteria. But they have built a superb replica of it. If you go to France, you really must see it. It really is an absolutely genuine replica. Fortunately, I date back to the years of Methuselah, so I did manage to see the original before they shut it. What did all this mean? We talked about it earlier, but I'll talk about it again. This is another cave called Pechmel. And Pechmel is famous for these two horses with spots on them, which are actually a coloring of a horse called Kozlowski's horse, which is now extinct, the Siberian horse. And it's one of the very few caves which you can still visit. And my friends, if you go to southwestern France, make a point of going to Pechmel, because you go down in these chambers and you can see the animals as the Stone Age people saw them, original. And it's very moving. But the thing that's most fascinating is this. Human hands placed against the wall, and on them they have blown red ochre or black powder, and then they have removed their hand. What on earth would somebody want to do that for? And the archaeologists believe that the reason they did it was that down in these caves, deep in the earth, in total darkness, and many, many years ago, I saw this, and I saw it again in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, where by accident I got shut into a pharaoh's tomb. You laugh. I'd walked down into the chamber, no one there, I won't bore you with the details. And I got in there, and I was in the burial chamber, which is this high chamber with stars on the ceiling, and then is the sarcophagus. And suddenly the lights went out. And the silence weighed on you. And I swear you could feel the Pharaoh's presence. Why do I mention this? The lights came on and the spell was gone. Why? Because if you go in these caves with a fat lamp, you're in the bowels of the earth. You're going towards the other world. And it's no coincidence they found the footprints of young people here, as if initiation rites were carried out in this cave. And they find the hands on the wall. What are these wall hands there for? Probably they feel that the power and the spirits of the animals, we know this from African caves, was in the spirits of the animals who lived behind the walls. And if you put your hand on the wall, you could derive power from the animals for hunting. Is this true? We'll never know, but it works. All I ask you to do when you leave is to put your hand on the wall of the Linda Hall Library, and you will gain power. But seriously, this really is something that suggests that there was a very intimate relationship between the world of the supernatural and the world of the living. I can't walk back further than this, I'm sorry, because of the cameraman over there. But the other thing that's fascinating is they made some extraordinary mobile art as well. Some of this was pure decoration, like the decoration you see on these harpoons here. Why did they use a harpoon? A harpoon is a spearhead which is attached to a line to a shaft. And if I spear the gentleman over there, which I'm sure I'm not going to do, the harpoon would stick in his body, he would run away, and I would have a line on him. The line would be attached to the shaft, and maybe the shaft would slow him down. It's particularly effective, of course, with sea mammals, with floats. Very superior weaponry, but also magnificent pieces of art, like the spear thrower. Look, the stick and the hook. Why the holes? So he could carry it. Imagine a spear here. But this one has a weight. Why a weight? It gives you greater heft. But why of this one, which is of a mountain goat going to the bathroom, and the hook is the feces there? It's a joke. This probably was a ceremonial artifact, but it shows you in the sculptor in the mound just how gifted these people were. And then there are a series, and these are rather older than some of the stuff I've shown you, of female figurines. Some of them, like the one on the right, have very exaggerated breasts and sexual features. No face, just hair. There are dozens of these. What do they mean? Almost certainly they were ceremonial artifacts, and most people believe that they were in fact fertility symbols. We don't know. But then in contrast, there was this very nice lady with a face shown and long hair, identical to surfer chicks in California. And one wonders what all this means, because deep in the caves also, you find clay carvings of bison. And around them, you find the footprints of children. And this is hundreds of feet from the entrance. Oh, Altamira. Am I going on too long? Oh, Altamira in northern Spain. Well, back in 1875, a Spanish nobleman was excavating, and his 9-year-old daughter begged to go along with him. And she soon got bored as he was digging holes in the mud. And she wandered into a side chamber with a candle. And suddenly he heard his daughter cry, "Toros, toros," bulls, bulls. This is a true story. And he crawled into a chamber, and the chamber literally is, the ceiling is lower than the distance from the floor here to the ceiling. And there, on the roof, he saw bison painted in many colors on protuberances in the rock. Bison, as if they had been viewed from above. Ultimate masterpieces of people who were as modern as we are. And what happened to these people? What happened to the Neanderthals? By 30,000, the Neanderthals had vanished. Almost certainly, although we can never prove it, they died out in the face of people with vastly superior technology and intellectual abilities who pushed them out, and eventually they could no longer form viable breeding groups and died out. Probably the last Neanderthals were in South Spain. But what happened at the end of the Ice Age? This is one of the last Cro-Magnon paintings. Look at these magnificent bison. The horns, the mane, and the ruff. This is the ultimate. About 12,000 years ago. By this time, warming was well underway, and life was changing. And the Cro-Magnons, who were smart people, had to adapt. Many of them moved north following reindeer. Ice sheets, after 15,000 years ago, were retreating. Sea levels were rising in places by feet a year. Temperatures in the summer were much higher. Winters were shorter. What did people do? One response was to move north following the reindeer, who moved north to the shores of an emerging Baltic Sea. Others, now using bows, which came into use in the late Ice Age, hunted reindeer and deer in forests. And increasingly, people depended on wild vegetable foods and on fish. I could give you a lecture for an hour and a half just on this change. But I just want to give you something to think about when we think today about rising, whoa dear, sea levels. And that is the North Sea. Some of you may have crossed from England to the Netherlands on very rough water on a ferry. This is the North Sea approximately 10,000 years ago. There's Norway, there's Scotland. And look at this. The whole of the South North Sea is dry land. The Elbe River comes out here, the Rhine comes out and flows into the English Channel because England is rapidly being separated from the continent, alas, or hooray, depending on who you are. And then, about 8,000 years, look at this. An island here called Dogger, that actually in today is the Dogger Bank. Some islands here, and England is now forming its own familiar shape with the English Channel. This is just one of the changes which happened. When you get a 400-foot sea level change, you get very radical change. And this resulted in northern Europeans, for example, becoming not so much hunters, but fishermen, fowlers, and people spearing fish. And this period, by archaeologists, is called the Mesolithic. I wouldn't waste your time remembering it. It was a period when camps were by water. They moved constantly. People began to use dugout canoes. The technology was simple, but they still adapted to forests. And the excavation of these is extremely fine-grained and very difficult. Because with that adaptation, our story ends. Except for one final thing. Have a beer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
We have time for a few questions. If you raise your hand, I'll come
If
by with the microphone.
anybody asks me if the Neanderthals had sex with the Cro-Magnons, I will scream loudly. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't a clue.
The answer to that will be at the May 3rd lecture with Ed Green.
And if I may say one more thing,
Yes, sir.
I really strongly recommend you, when I'm not in the publicity business, to have a look at the exhibit of the books here of the early archaeologists who had studied this stuff. They are fascinating. Makes you realize how far we've come.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that you didn't think that the Neanderthals had a sense of spirituality, but it's been a lot of years ago, and it may be incorrect. I read that the Neanderthals had bear skulls placed prominently in caves, and also flowers in their graves.
Ah, yes, that is a cave called Shanidar in Iraq. There are instances of Neanderthals burying the dead. The only one where there are grave goods are the flowers from Shanidar. Unfortunately, this was dug by a gentleman whose scientific methods are not impeccable, but it's in the literature and there's no way of checking it. Quite how much of a belief in the afterlife they have, we don't know.
What about the cave bear skulls?
The
Cave bear skulls?
The cave bear skulls, no one knows.
Any more questions? Oh, yes, ma'am.
How did early man protect their meat? I mean, how did they keep the meat fresh?
Almost certainly they did three things. One, they probably refrigerated it with a lot of ice and permafrost. Secondly, they dried it in the wind and sun, or they smoked it. These are all technologies that have been around a long time, and you can be sure they were well aware of beef jerky. For example, if you kill 50 reindeer, what the hell are you going to do with the meat? And the answer is they processed it. And there is some evidence of this. And in the case of things like hares and Arctic animal foxes, there was evidence that they skinned the animals and just simply took the fur. Oh yeah, there was nothing they didn't know about butchery.
Any more questions? All right, thank you, Dr. Fagan.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being an audience that laughed. It makes a hell of a difference, believe me.
And thank you for attending tonight's lecture. Our next lecture is April 24th with Donald Johansen. Thank you and good night.